Diversity and inclusion. In this module, we will discuss concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion, the role RSOs play in creating an inclusive campus culture, and your responsibilities to this goal as RSO leaders. The concept of diversity includes all of the ways in which people differ and encompasses the varying characteristics that make one individual or group different from another. A broad definition includes not only race, ethnicity, and gender, the groups that most often come to mind when the term diversity is used, but also age, national origin, religion, disability, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, education, marital status, language, and physical appearance. It also involves different ideas, perspectives, and values. The term diversity only refers to the makeup of a group. It's important to know that just because a group is made up of various people, it doesn't mean those people are meant to feel included or valued. That's where inclusion comes in. Inclusion is involvement and empowerment, where the inherent worth and dignity of all people are recognized. An inclusive university promotes and sustains a sense of belonging. It values and practices respect for the talents, beliefs, backgrounds, and ways of living of its members. The concept includes authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals and/or groups into processes, activities, and decision and policy making in a way that shares power. An inclusive UNLV allows students to be respected and appreciated as valuable members of their communities. Students are able to fully participate and engage with RSOs and feel comfortable attending their programs and activities. With this larger goal in mind, let us examine several concepts of prejudice and social injustice that impedes its attainment. What is racism? Racism occurs between individuals on an interpersonal level and is embedded in organizations and institutions through their policies, procedures, and practices. In general, it may seem easier to recognize individual or interpersonal acts of racism, a slur made, a person ignored in a social or work setting, an act of violence. However, individual racism is not created in a vacuum, but instead emerges from a society's foundational beliefs and ways of seeing or doing things, and is manifested in organizations, institutions, and systems, including education. Now that we've defined what racism is, let's delineate between individual and systemic racism. Individual racism refers to an individual's racist assumptions, beliefs, behaviors, or actions. It is a form of racial discrimination that stems from conscious and unconscious personal prejudice. Individual racism is connected to and learned from broader socioeconomic histories and processes, and is supported and reinforced by systemic racism. In contrast to individual racism, systemic racism includes the policies and practices entrenched in established institutions which result in the exclusion or promotion of designated groups. It differs from overt discrimination in that no individual intent is necessary. Systemic racism refers to the rules, practices, and customs once rooted in law. These may have changed over time, resulting in a facade of equality, but the residual effects can reverberate throughout entire societal systems. Systemic racism manifests itself in two ways: institutional racism, which is racial discrimination that derives from individuals carrying out the dictates of others who are prejudiced or of a prejudiced society. Structural racism refers to inequalities rooted in the system-wide operation of a society that excludes substantial numbers of members of particular groups from significant participation in major social institutions. Systemic racism can be seen in almost every facet of life in America, including education, hiring and advancement practices, access to affordable and safe housing, healthcare, incarceration, governmental representation, earning potential, and household wealth. It is important to honestly ask yourself, what are the systems or rules at UNLV and in your organization that impede equal access to involvement? What can and should you be doing as a leader in your organization to actively change those systems? How can you leverage the power of your position to enact real improvements in the campus climate? A person's identity consists of the various characteristics they use to categorize and define themselves and are constructed by those around them. Some aspects of identity are visible, such as skin color. Others may not be easily known, such as the languages you speak or the country in which you were born. Still, others are often invisible, such as religion or sexual orientation. Identities cannot and should not be assumed about an individual. What is incredibly important is that the identities each individual holds are innate to who they are and inform the ways in which they see and interact with the world around them. Marginalized identities are those that have been systematically disempowered by denying access to resources, enforcing institutional prejudice, and/or not allowing for that individual or community's voice, history, or perspective to be heard. I think many of us could easily provide examples of explicit racism in the world, but less overt forms of oppression can be incredibly damaging. Let's talk about a few of these now. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. The implicit associations we harbor in our subconscious cause us to have feelings and attitudes about other people based on characteristics such as race, ethnicity, age, and appearance. These associations develop over the course of a lifetime, beginning at a very early age through exposure to direct and indirect messages. Many studies have indicated that implicit biases affect individuals' attitudes and actions, thus creating real-world implications, even though individuals may not even be aware that those biases exist within themselves. Notably, implicit biases have been shown to trump individuals' stated commitment to equality and fairness, thereby producing behavior that diverges from the explicit attitude that people may profess. Everyone holds these unknown biases as they have been ingrained and learned within us our whole lives. What's important is that we're able to recognize these biases and confront them in our own thoughts and actions. As RSO leaders, you need to be willing to take note of how your biases could and do influence the choices you make in your organizations. Ask yourself and other leaders in your organization how these biases hinder your ability to create inclusive communities, and then figure out how you will actively work to reframe your decision-making. As with all of the topics we discuss in this module, open and transparent communication about the influence of our biases is essential. Privilege is the idea that individuals from dominant groups benefit from unearned and largely unacknowledged advantages, even when those advantages aren't discriminatory. It can serve to oppress individuals in marginalized identities. Being part of a privileged group doesn't mean your life hasn't been hard or that your accomplishments are unearned. It means that your identity in a marginalized group isn't one of the things making it harder. Simply put, these are the benefits you are born into and have done nothing to earn. Privilege is hard to see for those who are born with access to power and resources. It is very visible for those to whom privilege was not granted. The subject can be extremely difficult to talk about because people in dominant groups don't necessarily feel powerful or that they have been afforded things others have not. As Dr. Frances Kendall wrote in the book Understanding White Privilege, quote, "It is sort of like asking fish to notice water or birds to discuss air. For those who have privileges based on race or gender or class or physical ability or sexual orientation or age, it just is. It's normal." There are plenty of other types of privilege, but white privilege is perhaps the most enduring throughout American history. Let's examine just a few of these. Race. White individuals likely don't worry that their ethnic-sounding name will prevent them from getting a job interview or that they may be stopped by the police simply because of the color of their skin. Citizenship. Simply being born in this country affords you certain privileges non-citizens will never access. Class. Being born into a financially stable family can help guarantee greater access to healthcare, safer neighborhoods, higher quality education, etc., that are not readily available to those from lower income families. Sexual orientation. By being born straight, every state in this country affords you opportunities that non-straight folks have had to lobby and fight for in the Supreme Court. Gender identity. By being born male, you can assume that you can walk through a parking garage without worrying you'll be sexually assaulted, or that a defense attorney will then blame it on you on what you were wearing. By being born cisgender, you aren't concerned when going out in public that you can safely enter the bathroom of your choosing. Ability. By being born able-bodied, you probably don't have to worry if every classroom you enter or event you attend will accommodate your mobility, hearing, or vision needs. How does knowledge of your privileges affect the decision-making and leadership of your organization? Are you looking at your choices through the lens of non-privileged groups of students? As a leader, are you setting the example that privilege should be openly questioned in group discussions? Coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, intersectionality describes how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. As a framework, it examines how multiple social identities such as race, class, gender, sexual orientation, disability, etc., interact to form interconnected and compounding systems of marginalization among individuals and groups. Intersectionality is an approach largely advanced by women of color, arguing that classifications such as gender, race, class, and others cannot be examined in isolation from one another. They interact and intersect in an individual's lives, in society, in social systems, and are of mutual importance. For example, a black woman in America does not experience gender inequalities in exactly the same way as a white woman, nor racial oppression identical to that experienced by a black man. Each race and gender intersection produces a qualitatively distinct life. In your RSOs, it is important to remember that each member of your organization holds multiple intersecting identities. Let's think of an academic organization as an example. Everyone in that organization may share the same major, but a member who is cisgender, able-bodied, veteran, woman of color, comes to that experience much differently than a white, non-binary, traditional age student living with an invisible disability. Respecting and honoring these diverse identities is a key component of building an inclusive community in your organization. Racial color blindness refers to the idea that people don't see race and view everyone as the same. When someone says or thinks they don't see people differently because of race or ethnicity, they are erasing that person's lived experiences. They are saying, I don't see you for who you are, I'm seeing you as I want to see you. Acknowledging differences is not a bad thing. These identities are an incredibly large part of who a person is. The idea of a colorblind society, while perhaps well-intentioned, leaves people without the language to discuss race and examine their own bias. Colorblindness relies on the concept that race-based differences don't matter and ignores the realities of systemic racism. For those in minority groups, hearing this term can feel like their culture and history are not valued, which can sometimes be the opposite intention of those who say it. Microaggressions are brief and commonplace daily, verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults to marginalized individuals or groups. They're more than just insults, insensitive comments, or mean behavior. They're the kind of remarks, questions, or actions that are painful because they have to do with a person's membership in a group that's discriminated against or subject to stereotypes. Let's talk about some examples of microaggressions. When an Asian or Latinx American is assumed to be foreign-born and may be asked questions like, where are you really from? Told, you speak good English, or asked to teach someone in their native tongue. The message being that they can't actually be American. When the intelligence of an individual is assumed based on their race, they may hear something like, you are so articulate, which communicates the idea that someone of their race is not expected to be as intelligent as a white person. On the other end of the spectrum, assuming an Asian person is good at math or science simply because of the idea that all Asians are good at that. Assuming the criminal intent of an individual based on race. This can be seen as an individual who crosses the street simply because they see a person of color walking their way, or a store owner following them around because they assume all individuals of that race steal. Asking or expecting someone to shorten or anglicize an ethnic name because it's too difficult for you to learn or to pronounce. These microaggressions often happen casually, frequently, and without harm intended. The impact, on the other hand, can be incredibly painful for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or those of other marginalized identities, who have likely heard these microaggressions repeatedly over time. As RSO leaders, not only should you be actively working to avoid using these microaggressions yourself, but you should be knowledgeable enough to notice them when you hear them or see them, and courageous enough to call them out. They may seem small and insignificant in the moment to someone with privilege, but the accumulation of microaggressions over time can cause environments to feel exclusionary and unsafe for members of your organization. Cultural appropriation is the theft of cultural elements for one's own use, commodification, or profit, including symbols, art, language, customs, etc., often without understanding, acknowledgement, or respect for its value in the original culture. This results from the assumptions of a dominant culture's right to take other cultures' elements. Appropriation is exploitative and cheats minorities out of the credit they deserve for their creations. The reason borrowing these cultural elements is offensive stems from a lack of true understanding of their significance. Often, the way they're used merely perpetuates a myth. Promoting the myths rather than the truth behind the story trivializes entire races of people. By overlooking the real stories, it's easy to disregard the suffering people have endured. Let's talk about some examples. Sugar skulls as decorative elements by non-Mexicans. Halloween costumes that stereotype or diminish another culture, such as a native headdress. Fashion shows where white individuals wear the hairstyles of other cultures as a fashion statement without the negative consequences often felt by the marginalized groups that they belong to. Referring to a group of people as a tribe or a meeting as a powwow, which can negate the significance of these terms to indigenous people. As cultural historian Danielle Bainbridge said in her PBS series Origin of Everything, quote, appropriation happens when you have a position of power or a member of a dominant culture who is able to take the parts of a marginalized culture that you enjoy, divorce them from their original meaning, and use them for entertainment value without considering their original context or having to deal with the negative ramifications that someone from that culture would have to deal with as a result of that same action. So while it may seem benign to the person who is extracting and enjoying the culture, the resulting damage can have real-world implications for the people whose culture have been misrepresented or misused. Cultural appreciation is when you earnestly seek to learn about or explore a different culture. You learn, you listen, you strive to understand. You seek to honor its beliefs and traditions, not for your own personal gain, but to simply honor the culture and its people. Let's talk about an example of a culturally appreciative activity your RSO can engage in. Instead of the earlier example of just using sugar skulls to decorate your Halloween event, your organization could co-sponsor a collaborative event with another RSO that celebrates Mexican culture, where you learn about the history and cultural significance of sugar skulls as part of the celebration of Dia de los Muertos. Let's now turn our focus to the makeup of our UNLV community. UNLV is currently ranked as one of the most diverse colleges and universities in the U.S. by U.S. News & World Report. In addition, UNLV is designated by the Department of Education as a minority-serving institution, known by the acronym MSI, an Hispanic-serving institution, known by the acronym HSI, and an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander-serving institution, commonly referred to by the acronym ANAPISI. An important thing to note here is that these are distinctions based on the statistics of UNLV and do not speak to how well we serve and support these populations. Let's drill down a bit further on some of these demographics. 57% of UNLV's degree-seeking undergraduates reported being part of a racial or ethnic minority. Of that, Hispanic students make up the largest minority of undergraduate students at about 19%. Approximately 1,800 students are active duty, reserve, or veterans of the military, and UNLV is ranked as a top 15% veteran-friendly university. There are roughly 1,100 international students at UNLV. 25% of undergraduate students are over the age of 25. Undergraduate students over the age of 25 are often considered to be non-traditional. Other attributes of non-traditional students may include those who have served in the military, have children, worked for a number of years before pursuing higher education, and often work full-time while enrolled, to name a few. 1,900 students receive accommodations from the Disability Resource Center. As RSO leaders, how does your organization meet the unique needs of your members, who obviously come from incredibly diverse backgrounds? For example, let's delve a bit more into the non-traditional student category. Non-traditional students are more likely to have different schedules where events in certain timeframes aren't as accessible to them. How are you working to ensure they are able to get involved? Do you hold events and meetings at times that are flexible? Do you welcome students to bring their families to programs and events? Often older than the average student at UNLV, how are you ensuring your members' activities appeal to students in a wider range of ages? For our students who receive accommodations with the DRC, have you thought about universal design for your programs and events? Universal design means that your event is accessible to all, regardless of ability. A great activity we encourage RSO leadership teams to engage in is to look at the diversity of students on campus. For each group, talk specifically about how you are making the path to involvement in your RSO easier. What roadblocks or barriers can you lift or lessen? The image on this slide conveys an important sentiment. In this illustration, a person holds up a sign which reads, "Normalize changing your opinion on something after learning new information. It's okay, I promise." This is a message we want to make sure is encouraged not only within yourselves, but that you convey to the other members of your organization. Everyone has an opportunity to learn more and do better. Being able to do so comes from an understanding that it's okay to afford yourselves the space to unlearn problematic behavior, admit to previous mistakes, and move forward with a commitment to improvement. One of the best ways you can encourage the same line of thinking among the officers and members of your organization is through modeling the same attitudes in your own actions. Multicultural competency and decision-making. Multicultural competency is a process of learning about and becoming allies with people from other cultural backgrounds, thereby broadening our own understanding and ability to positively interact with diverse people and groups. The key element to becoming more culturally competent is respect for the ways that others live in and organize the world, and an openness to learn from them. Learn how to interact with diverse student populations. Provide culturally appropriate resources and information. Believe that students' experiences will be more satisfying if the students' cultural knowledge and values are understood and integrated appropriately in RSO planning and decision-making. In the end, upholding the values of diversity and inclusion in your leadership leads to culturally competent decision-making. Cultural competence is essential for effective decision-making. Student leaders who incorporate cultural competence and ethical decision-making will be empowered to provide the best services to students in multicultural contexts to ensure optimum outcomes. Student organizations are just one piece of a larger picture of the student experience at UNLV, but can be very impactful. A positive experience with an RSO can help students develop a connection to UNLV and find a community where someone feels like they fit in. On the flip side, a negative experience, particularly one that ranges anywhere from feeling exclusionary to discriminatory, can be incredibly harmful. That experience is often dictated by the decisions made by organization advisors and the leadership shown by officers and members in that organization. RSOs are often the place where students find their support network and foster a sense of belonging. They allow students to gain exposure to cultures, belief systems, and lived experiences that are very different from their own. RSOs can create inclusion through thoughtful and intentional purpose or mission statements, as well as governing documents, recruitment practices that make all interested students feel like they belong in your organization, marketing materials that are accessible and speak to the varying types of students on our campus, educating your members and creating a space where discussion about ways to improve your organization include expanded access and inclusion, celebrate and embrace your differences in ways that make diverse members feel valued for exactly who they are, create an organizational vocabulary that is inclusive and welcoming and that is free from previously mentioned oppressions like microaggressions and bias. Advocate, advocate, advocate. RSO leaders often have significantly more power on this campus than they realize. Use the power of your leadership role, your organization on campus, and the community of RSOs you are part of to push for real and meaningful change that will better the lives of students at UNLV. One of the foremost guidelines for existing as an RSO on campus is that organizations may not discriminate on the basis of race, age, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, veteran status, or disability. Meeting this mandate should be seen as a bare minimum. The involvement team strongly encourages each organization and their leadership to do more than just not discriminate. As Dr. Ibram Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, writes, "The opposite of racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist." He continues to say that the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, then dismantle it. Anti-racism is the practice of identifying, challenging, and changing the values, structures, and behaviors that perpetuate systemic racism. Being an anti-racist means to actively oppose racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. While this concept focuses on the idea of dismantling racism, the same concepts can and should be applied to other forms of systemic oppression, such as discrimination based on gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, or class, for example. As author and activist Ijeoma Oluo writes, "The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward." So where does one start in their journey to becoming an anti-racist if they haven't already? This image helps illustrate that. The diagram highlights the journey from the fear zone through the learning zone and into the growth zone. In the fear zone, individuals deny that racism is a problem, avoid asking hard questions about race, seek comfort, and limit conversations to those that look and think like them. If an individual takes the initiative, they can progress to the learning zone. A person in the learning zone recognizes that racism is a present and current problem. They seek out questions that make them uncomfortable. They understand that their previous ignorance of racism is a result of their own privilege. They educate themselves about race and structural racism. They agree to be vulnerable about their own biases and gaps in knowledge. And they listen to others who look and think differently than them. The goal in this process is to reach the growth zone. A person in the growth zone identifies how they have unknowingly benefited from racism in their life. They promote and advocate for policies and leaders that are anti-racist. They sit in their own discomfort and speak out when they see racism occur. They help to educate their peers on how racism harms their profession, organization, or group. They understand that mistakes may be made, but are not deterred from becoming better. They yield positions of power to those otherwise marginalized, and they surround themselves with others who think and look differently than them. So what can you do as an RSO leader to encourage an anti-racist mindset in your organization? In addition to the previous practices discussed, review your mission statement, governing documents, and leadership structure. How can you make systemic changes in your own organization? Make a commitment as an organization that you will work to educate yourselves and engage in challenging conversations. Create a specific action plan for yourselves to follow. Don't just say you're going to be anti-racist. Talk about how you're going to be anti-racist. Make reading lists. Create time and space in your regular meetings to continue discussing these topics. Plan partnerships with other RSOs. Tailor this plan to meet your specific organization. For example, say you're an academic RSO focused on students entering the medical field. Schedule an event or meeting to learn about why the maternal mortality rate for Black mothers is so much higher than white mothers, and talk about the ways in which you will address this when you enter the profession. Call out racist and discriminatory practices and actions when you see them. Refuse to be silent and take a stance to stand up for other organizations when they do the same. Agree to allow space for learning and growth without expecting perfection. For many, the fear of failing, saying something wrong, and stepping in it keeps them from trying at all. Whether new to this work or having engaged in it for a long time, focus on making your RSO an environment where the intention to be better is valued. In your commitment to allyship, remember that the voices of marginalized groups should be centered in conversations. Those with privilege should be sure not to make it about themselves. To do this, Listen when people of marginalized identities share their own experiences. Amplify the messages they are saying so their thoughts and ideas are heard in their own voices instead of being recentered by privileged voices. Speak up when you witness injustice or have an opportunity to educate or advocate. Committing to being an organization that values the diversity of its members and the campus community and is truly inclusive for all isn't easy, but it's necessary. We'll leave you with this quote. No matter how open-minded, socially conscious, anti-racist I think I am, I still have old, learned, hidden biases that I need to examine. It is my responsibility to check myself daily for stereotypes, prejudice, and ultimately discrimination. References used for developing this training, as well as additional resources to learn about social change, can be found online at bit.ly/rsomodreferences. In addition to student involvement and activities, other departments on campus that can help provide resources in diversity and inclusion training, education, and support include the Intersection, the Care Center, and the Office of Equal Employment and Title IX.